Dear Esther is the Chinese Room's initial offering in the first-person exploration genre. The nascent studio had created a handful of mods for the Source engine in the late 2000s, and Dear Esther was the first of them to see a full release on Steam in 2012. The re-release, known as Dear Esther Landmark Edition, which is the subject of this review, was released in 2017 on Steam, PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. As an entry in the somewhat snarkily named walking simulator genre, the premise of Dear Esther is not difficult to comprehend. The gist of the game is to explore the location in which the player happens to find themselves and, in a distinctly solitary manner, to piece together as much as possible about who you are, what has happened, or why you came to be there. It's interesting to note that games like Dear Esther were presumably limited in budget, and thus often had to be creative in choosing how to unfold their stories, particularly, it seems, when it comes to depicting characters. Over time, however, it must have become clear that isolation played such a strong role in these types of games that having characters that are too real might seem strange. As a result, such games must choose ways to convey their story that avoid making characters too concrete. This is all easy to grasp, but what isn't as easy to comprehend is the style Dear Esther uses to convey its narrative, even though the mechanism of delivery for story and exposition is very simple. As the player explores the setting, a wet grey Hebridean island, a narrator slowly unfolds the central mystery in time with the player uncovering more and more of the island. What is of more interest than this, however, is the epistolic layout of the narration, as well as the narrator's obtuse style and word choice. One of the very first things the player notices about the game, in fact, is this stylistic choice, which comes across, at first blush, as wordy, weakly poetic, and maybe even slightly pretentious. This deliberately impenetrable language is an immediate affront. On top of this, players are rather quickly introduced to characters and people who are only briefly or vaguely described. In one way, this amplifies the effect of feeling like you're eavesdropping on a private conversation, and thus strengthening the sense of the well-established concrete relationship behind the messages. On the other hand, however, I found that if it was an attempt to engage my curiosity about who these people actually were, it wasn't so effective. Perhaps on purpose, it's hard to distinguish between real and metaphorical, or historical and contemporary characters, and in combination with the word choice, players might find frustration early in the game with the inability to replay these moments of narration to make sense of them. Players are simply forced to wait for whatever comes next to see what they can piece together. What these stylistic choices do the best, however, is effectively convey the character behind the messages. Players can pick up on the narrator's interest in science and history, especially that of the island, while the tone of the messages conveys a deep sense of what seems like drama and sarcasm that brings with it an ability to cause misdirection and confusion in players' understanding. While it's hard to say whether this creative decision does much to enhance the sense of mystery, following the immediate aversion I mention, these elements definitely manage to blossom later in the game by using this strong sense of character to make suggestions about a sort of hopeless anguish and frustrated confusion that's built on questioning whether oneself is being overly dramatic, or by conveying how victim and perpetrator blur together in a wash of muddled sadness caused by an obsessive drive to find meaning in tragedy. While it's tempting to opt for cliché by saying that the location of the game is itself a character, I think it's more correct to say that the island of Dear Esther has a distinct and unique charm and personality. This may sound strange, considering that the island might seem at first like a greyish-green slab of rock and sand, but much like the Chinese Room's other work, it's clear that the developers poured considerable effort into an accurate portrayal of this part of the British Isles. What's apparent immediately, in fact, is that the space is finite. This is based largely on the player's knowledge that the island must be limited in scope. I found this actually did rather a lot to give me more patience during exploration, and combined with the sense of solitude that is a key to these types of games, I found that winding my way slowly across the island was quite peaceful in a distinctly sparse and windswept North Atlantic way. The game also does its best to be subtly colourful in what things it can, like wildflowers and the particular hue of the inky blue sky. There is immense care also found in things like the dirty sand with thick grass growing in it that always seems to become a trap for various kinds of rubbish, or that particular type of slimy, dark green seaweed that's often washed ashore on rainy days. Another interesting feature of this overcast island is the persistent howling wind that becomes a steadfast companion on your strolls along the precarious cliff walks. This acts as an extremely effective tool for giving an extra layer of isolation to the player. This is the type of wind that might make communication with a friend or partner on a hike quite difficult, and often encourages you to trudge on silently and look inwardly on your own thoughts. This is a wonderful tool the game subtly wields to help encourage reflection on the narrator's revelations. While traversing the different areas of the island, you'll notice the developers pay close attention to present the small but significant landmarks from different angles. The island's paths often return you to the other side of what you've seen already. In this way, the game attempts to engage in a form of environmental metaphor. By trying to convey the idea of things looking differently at different stages of your metaphorical journey, the game hints at the idea of an unreliable narrator, as well as suggesting that you can replay the game with the knowledge you gain, while also generally reinforcing uncertainty and instability as core elements of the narrator's journey. The game also ties the themes of the story to certain landmarks of the island, as well as mixing in elements of what has happened to bring the narrator to this place. The broader themes of the game include loss, tragedy, and anguish, but perhaps the strongest theme in the game is that of ascent or destination, with the corresponding alternative of a fall or descent. This has obvious emotional implications and is instantiated by the blinking red beacon of a radio tower. This has visual as well as thematic implications of its own and acts as a guide as you wind the windswept paths. It also contains a strange mixture of being a modern human means of communication, in contrast to the style of narration, but is found alone on the isolated island. The aforementioned idea of ascent is also reminiscent of pilgrimage, and it remains unclear to me after 2 playthroughs if the main character has in fact been to this place before, and this of course more literally plays on the idea of multiple playthroughs of the game. Though it might be difficult to wrestle with these ideas as you play, what is more clear is the very well conveyed progression of the narrator, whose frustration and anguish you can feel bubble and boil as his pilgrimage nears its conclusion. Late on in the experience, this becomes quite affecting, and stands in stark contrast to the player's initial aversion to him. The reversal of this dynamic, and the effective portrayal of the narrator's emotional state, even if you're not entirely sure what is actually going on, is worth a special commendation because it conveys both how he feels and his deep confusion about feeling it. Whilst on the idea of ascent or crescendo, I want to touch briefly on the music and audio. Although a true musical analysis is far beyond the scope of this review, it deserves mention as a distinct point of emphasis and identity in games made by the Chinese Room. I've mentioned how effective the whistling wind and rustling grass can be in generating a sort of bubble for reflection for the player, but amongst it can be found a simple, rather lonely piano motif. This motif is echoed with high, almost lachrymose strings that are often combined with cello for a deep, powerful effect. The piano, something that sounds strangely similar to an early Coldplay album, is often layered together with the strings to give motion or delicacy. Musical moments, then, are often structured to align with moments of visual or voiced exposition to elicit powerful emotion, and in doing so, complement the story and its emphasis on the emotional layer of the narrator's journey. Very briefly, I want to mention an element of this release of the game. I wrote the rest of this review before trying the director's commentary, and for someone who had already engaged in analysis of the game, this was a very enjoyable insight into the minds of the creators. Although it may not appeal to people who are not engaged by the game, I believe it will be of great value for anyone who takes a deep interest in Dear Esther. Dear Esther is a short game. To a new player, it takes maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours to see the ending. The game also invites replaying, so as a conclusion, I think it's worth considering what is the best way to enjoy Dear Esther. The early moments of distaste for the narrator, and the frustration felt of trying to piece together the rather unique dialogue, stand as the greatest obstacle to the game definitely getting its hooks into you. Admittedly, this will likely be balanced out by the oftentimes truly effective sense of calm and solitude, as well as the starkly contrasted emotional anguish that lingers intriguingly behind the atmosphere and dense storytelling. On top of this, it seems that an understanding of the major points of revelation and the emotional journey can still be enjoyed without piecing together exactly who is who, and in this way, it's hard to be too critical of the dense style over time. As a result, I think the game can have appeal to many cases of player. There is definitely appeal of Dear Esther as a short, finite experience with little time investment. I, meanwhile, had my fill after 2 playthroughs and the director's commentary, and the game provides a great depth for those who want to dig as deeply as possible into the game and its many layers of meaning.